The day began with iron and ended with questions. Gendry woke to the taste of cinders on his tongue, and a forge already warm. The coals banked overnight to save on wood. The city was quiet in that slant of dawn between the last shouts of the alehouses and the first clatter of the baker's pans, a hush that made his hammer sound like a chapel bell. He liked that hour, when the street beyond his shutters lay empty, and he could pretend the world was only heat and weight, and the steady rhythm of himself. A man might shape a life as he shaped a blade, with pressure and patience and a good eye. He worked a bar of stubborn low-carbon iron into a curve for a wheel rim, watching the metal go from soot dark to cherry, from cherry to that high, hot yellow that made everything around it dim. He turned it with the tongs and thought of nothing at all, the way he had learned to do when the thoughts were more danger than help. When the heat was right, he drew the piece, hammered the shoulder, checked the curve against his pattern, and set it back in for another heat. The quench hissed like a whisper. The scent of it, brine and steam and scale, put him in mind of ships he'd never ridden, sails he'd never seen, and he cursed himself for thinking of anything but the work. A shape darkened the doorway. The hammer fell once more. Gendry set it down, rolled his shoulder, and looked. Davos Seaworth stood in the threshold as if he'd grown there, sea-weathered and ordinary as a broom, which was a lie his eyes could not keep. A knight may cut a fine figure in plates and plumes, but the sight of Davos in a plain cloak said other things. A man who had knelt and risen. A man who knew how to carry a bitter truth like a hot coal and not drop it on the floor. "You'll scorch your lungs breathing that," Davos said, not moving. "And you've scarce enough manners left to offer a man a stool." "The stool's for those who pay in coin," Gendry said. Because he could not say "come in," because he could not say the name that had sat in his throat all morning like a swallowed bone. "Why have you come?" "Lucky for me," Davos said mildly, "that I've never been overburdened by coin." He came into the shop without waiting, as was his way, and shut the door against the wind. The knock of shutters above said the neighbors were waking. Somewhere a hawker called in a thin voice about turnips. "Do you tire of the forge?" Davos asked. "Or is there comfort in sameness that a man who's seen more storms than roofs cannot understand?" Gendry wiped his hands on a rag already black. "If you've come to mock my work, find a court singer. He'll do it prettier." "I've come," Davos said, and the levity lifted off his face like a gull from a rail. "Because men who know better than I do have made a mistake. They've left the choosing of a king to lords alone." Gendry turned back to the coals to hide the way his jaw clenched. "I am no lord. The realm provided you with a different gift," Davos said, as if he had all morning to use up and no more important place to spend it. "Blood, I mean. Not a thing a man asks for. Often not a thing a man wants." He drifted nearer to the anvil, peered at the rim. "Good work. True." "Madam?" Gendry heard the word blood, and felt again the hands on his shoulder from a wrong lifetime. Hands the size of dinner plates, heavy with cheer, lifting him to show him off as one might show off a strong colt. He swallowed, and now his throat was raw as if he'd drunk lye. "I poured that blood into the gutter years back," he said. "Hammered it into nails. It's no business of mine if lords squabble over who gets to sit on a chair they've sharpened to points. If it were only squabble." Davos' mouth thinned. "They've called a great council. Then they'll have a grand time of talk and wine and go home fat," Gendry said. "And the rest of us will be put to paying whatever they decide in the tin of our pots and the rags on our backs." "The council," Davos said, ignoring the shove. "We'll meet at Harrenhal in 3 weeks' time. The Faith and the Citadel both have put their hands to the letter, so every lord's going to treat it as gospel, commended by numbers. A settlement to end the end of endings, they call it. And if that's not a fool's phrase, I never heard one." "Nemiperpo? Harrenhal?" Gendry had never seen the place, only heard the stories. A castle cooked until its stones wept, haunted by ghosts who did not tire. Halls tall as the sky, and cold as famine. Why there? Because no man lives in it long enough to claim it, Davos said dryly. And because every road to it runs through someone else's grievance. So each lord thinks the journey a test for his enemies more than himself. He looked up, and now his eyes had gone keen. They planned to name a king. And for all the lists and pedigrees and old songs they'll bring to the feast, the one claim that keeps driving them back is the one they don't want to say aloud, for fear it makes peasants of their scrolls. Then see, Gendry said very quietly. Hammer and stag, bone and blood, Davos returned. A laugh as big as rain, a temper like summer storm, quick up, quick gone. The crown fallen where the hammer fell. They want peace that feels like victory. They want the memory of a man they drank with in better years. They want someone who won't make them bend the knee to a name they've been fighting since they were boys. They want to wash their hands and put down the swords and go home to wives they barely know anymore. They want Robert without the ruin. Some of them even want justice. Gendry felt the forge's heat on his face and wished it would burn the part of him that listened and found a sickening pull in what Davos said. Robert is dead. Davos said, and the word was a tolling bell. But he left too much of himself scattered among the streets and towers of this city to ever be wholly gone. Men and women are made of it, and some of them, too many, carry his look. You most of all. The council will talk of Targaryens and treaties, of Martells and Tyrells, and whose parchment is prettiest. But when it comes down to the last stick on the scales, the realm trusts a face they knew. The realm trusts the weight of a sack of flour. Gendry snapped. It trusts the taste of a clean cup of water. It trusts a road safe of bandits and a door that holds when you bar it. What do I know about giving that to anyone? I can make nails that hold for a winter. That's all I am. Then make nails for a realm, Davos said softly. Make a door that holds. Gendry laughed. It broke, and he let it. And they'll let me? The lords who would not let the smith's boy sit at their table? Now they'll place a crown on his head and bow? They'll do what the crowd of them decides they must, Davos said. That's all the council is, a way for men to tell themselves they obeyed a hall and not a man. They will dress it up in holy words and old tales. In the end, it is people in a room counting nods. And if there are enough nods for you, Gendry Waters, then you will be Gendry Baratheon. And the world will take a breath it's been holding so long it forgot how. Then no. Gendry set the rim aside with a gentleness his hands did not feel. He imagined a hall of high men with faces like carved wood, his own rough palms against a table he had built and not been invited to. He imagined Arya's wolf grin and the way it dared the world to say no again. He imagined the city quiet at dawn and bread cheap at the market, and small children with new boots for winter. He imagined a throne whose points had pierced every man that sat it. I'm not made for talking, he said at last. And I am not good with lies. Then tell the truth, Davos said. It's a rarer coin than rubies at such gatherings. He reached into his cloak and brought out a roll of parchment sealed with twin wax stamps. The seven-pointed star and the tower of the high tower. This is the summons I've been asked to carry. It calls you to Harrenhal to present your case and your person to the lords of the realm. I do not say you are the only man they'll consider. I do not say that you should be, but I say you should be there. Then? Gendry stared at the wax. He could imagine the press of the ring into warm red, the neatness of it. A pretty seal told 1,000 lies. He had no ring. He had a hammer and the breadth of his shoulders and a name that had gotten children tossed out of workshops when masters feared offending better men. He rubbed his thumb over the rag seam until the fabric frayed. If I go, he said, and they laugh, and they send me home to the forge, will you stand aside as the city turns me out as a braggart? I'll stand in the door and tell them to move me if they want to get to you, Davos said. He spoke as if he were offering to pour a cup of small beer. I lost my fingers for a better king than I was born under. I can spare my ribs for another. Gendry's mouth went dry. He took the scroll without knowing he would. The wax was cool against his skin. I'll need to find someone to keep the shop while I'm gone, he said, because some part of himself had fled to a narrow place and was throwing up any wall it could. I've spoken to Paedon Shoe Lane, Davos said. And it was a strange comfort to hear the name of a man who owed him for a set of nails 3 summers back. He'll cover your work at a fair cut. You've thought of everything. Only the small things, Davos said. The big ones I leave to luck or the stranger. Gendry took the iron one more heat to keep his hands from shaking. He watched the color come up as if the bar were some creature with a pulse of its own. At last he put it aside and reached for the cloak he wore when the wind bit, brown and patched and honest. He doused the forge and stood for a moment in the sudden silence that followed. A world without hammer. 3 weeks, he said. Harrenhal. It's a long road, Davos agreed. We won't be alone upon it. They were not. The king's road stretched north like a scar across a giant's skin, and along it came more bodies than Gendry had seen gathered for any feast day. Wagons creaked under the weight of casks and kegs, and the 100 small things people think they will need when they do not know what question they're going to be asked. Banners went up and down as if they were fish surfacing and diving. Gendry knew almost none of them, but the old men on the roadside muttered names as if counting prayers. Hightowers, White Tower caught by the sun. Redwing's twin grapes. Royce's runes on their bronze field, dull as old coins. Manderley's merman fat and merry as a lordling in a bath. Mormont's black bear, slouch-shouldered and pricked-eared. Davin Lannister's roaring lion, paled by dust. The small folk walked with their heads cocked, and there was a tightness about their jaws that Gendry felt in his own. The word council was a large word that did not tell a man whether he would have to sell his winter piglet for taxes come morning. Little boys ran after the wagons and tripped and laughed. One old woman laid a hand on Gendry's sleeve as he went by and said, "He had your eyes," and did not say who she meant. They camped in ditches and under hedges, and once, in a farmer's barn, after Gendry had replaced a broken tooth in the family's plow at dusk, the iron cooling and turning dark as the cows chewed and shifted. He liked doing that even more than he liked horseshoes. A plow's work was clean and long. It cut the earth in good lines. The farmer had called him my lord twice, and not even known he'd done it, which made Gendry itch under his skin like a boy in a borrowed shirt. At Maidenpool, they saw the sea, and Davos' face opened like a sailor's chest. When he finds a old knot, he tied himself. Seagulls mocked the world and the wind smelled sweetly of rot. Men on the docks eyed the influx, and adjusted their prices without bothering to hide it. Gendry kept his hammer wrapped in oiled cloth in his saddlebag, and wondered if the weight of it marked him out to any eye that knew what to look for. He had carried it on many roads. It had felt like safety then. Now it felt like a promise and a threat both. "You think they'll have me speak?" he asked Davos once, when the moon lay flat as a coin on the river and tents fluttered like night-blooming flowers all around them. "I think they'll have you listen," Davos said. "And then I think they'll expect you to turn a room with your breath. Decide what you want before you go in, lad. Not the pretty wants. The ugly ones. Do you want the North in your peace? Then decide if you'll let them keep a Winter King in all but name. Do you want the faith for ally or leash? Then decide how much gold and salt you can bear to pour down a hole that will never admit it is full. Do you want roads? Decide where to pull stones up and where to lay them. It'll be like mending a barrel with no hooped iron at hand. You can do it. You'll bleed your thumbs, but it can be done." "Benderol, I want," Gendry said, and stopped because the words that came were simple and so embarrassing he could not push them into the air. "I want the city to sleep. I want children to go to bed knowing their doors will hold." "That's a stupid thing to want." "It is the only thing worth wanting," Davos said. "Do not say it in the hall, but keep it at the root of your tongue." Harrenhal rose out of the green like some enormous bone the world had spat up. Gendry had thought to see ruin. He had not thought to see a ruin so large that it made the living look like ants. Towers slumped where heat had made them weep. Whoever had built it had been either a god or a fool, and Gendry felt both close by as they rode into the shadow of the outer walls. The place smelled of damp rock and old ash, and the iron of sprung bolts. Tents crowded its bailey, pavilions dressed in colors so proud they seemed a rebellion against the castle's gray. In the Godswood, what was left of it, someone had set benches. A sept had sprung up as if overnight, planks knocked together. The seven painted by a rushed hand but with surprising reverence. They lodged where Davos had arranged it, a corner of a long barracks that had once been for some lord's footmen and was now home to 50 claimants and their kin, every one of them believing for one night at least in the righteousness of his cause. Gendry rolled his cloak and lay his head on it. and watched the rafters web in the dark. He slept badly. He dreamed of a stag walking a shattered hall and stepping lightly as if conscious of the racket its hooves could make. On the morning of the first day, the hall was a sea of faces. They had set trestles in a great square with a clear space at the center for speaking, and in that space the light fell down from a broken window in the tower above, like dust made holy. The High Septon sat near the center, his robes plain compared to what Gendry remembered of that office, the scars on the man's hands unhidden. To his left a gray-bearded archmaester sat, rings heavy as a chain of small fish. Around them, tiers of men and women in their badges and best silks and worst frowns. Some nodded to Davos as they saw him. Some did not. Gendry felt eyes on him in the way one feels heat without seeing flame. They talked. Gods, they talked. A man in the colors of Duskendale spoke of charters and treaties, and the last good year before the war, and how that should be the measure of all things. A lady from the arbor spoke of sea roots and vines, and what a blockage in the mouth of the Blackwater would mean to their children, and her voice trembled only when she said children. Bronze young Royce talked of oaths as if they were stones you could pick up and weigh in your palm. Lord Wyman Manderley wheezed and spoke with such courtliness, Gendry could not tell if he were mocking everyone in the room or himself most of all. And then, suddenly, he ground his hand flat upon the table, so the cups leapt and said, "Bread," in a way that made the whole of it turn its head, and he spoke 3 minutes on bread that were more true than most had been an hour on crown. There were Targaryens in the air like ravens you cannot see, but hear the wing beat of. Each man with a cousin's daughter tucked somewhere in his tree, ready to claim that old name. There were words like dragons. There were words like fire. There were quieter words like mercy and rebuilding. And we are so tired, my lords. We are so very tired. The faith spoke of unity, and the citadel spoke of sanity, and the Lord spoke of taxes in the tone of men speaking of an unfaithful friend they loved still for the times he had been kind. Gendry sat and listened as Davos had said. He listened until the faces blended and separated again like foam. In a break he stood to piss on a root, and a stable boy of 14 summers, eyes too old, nodded to him and said, "I know you," and then flushed and fled, leaving Gendry with the awareness of his own body, as if he had put on borrowed boots. Near sunset on the second day a woman came to him wearing sober sapphire and white, a long sword at her side. She was tall, and moved like a person who had never been surprised by the way her limbs chose to untangle themselves. Her face was handsome and scarred, her hair bound back strictly. "Ser Brienne of Tarth," Davos murmured. "I wondered when we'd see the island." She nodded to Davos with a respect that looked like habit, and turned her clear, direct gaze on Gendry, as if he were a puzzle she intended to solve by counting its edges. "You're the smith," she said. The words did not make him feel smaller or larger. They put him on a level ground he had not expected to stand on. "I am," Gendry said, because to say more would be to pretend. "I knew your—" She stopped, not because she feared the word, Gendry thought, but because she weighed it and found it too light. "I fought beside King Renly," she said instead. He had a smile like the sun coming out, and a heart like a gilt cup left in the rain. She considered him, and he endured it. "If you become king, will you be like him?" "No," Gendry said without hesitation, and she blinked once, as if she had expected either a lie or a speech. "I will be like me. I'll be a man who can tell iron from steel by its sound, and I'll be a man who learned he was a bastard the way a dog learns he is a dog, by being kicked. I'll be a man who doesn't dance and doesn't drink much, because it makes him stupid, and there's enough stupidity in the world. I'll be a man who remembers what a leak costs in Flea Bottom in a winter when the docks froze. I'll be that man in a hall like this one, and if that makes me unfit, then I'd rather they decide it now while my hands still hold the shape of a hammer." "Gan." Brienne's mouth shifted as if something inside her were coming right without being forced. "Good," she said. "If I cast a vote," she added, and the corner of her mouth quirked, a rare bird's flit of humor, "it will be for a person and not a poster." "Lady Brienne," Davos said. If a time comes when the king requires a sword who keeps her oath better than anyone alive, I expect your name will be on his lips. It will need to be," she said. "I keep my oaths better than kings keep theirs." She inclined her head to Gendry in a way that was precisely equal, and went. That night they found themselves drinking small beer with Wyman, Manderley, and Bronze Jan, under a rough awning as rain made a music on skins. The fat lord consumed a trencher and a half of stewed eels, and waved a spoon like a baton. "If the realm is bread," he declared, "then the king is the oven. We have had ovens that burn everything you put near them, and ovens that never hold heat long enough to cook. We require something steady, my lords. A simple flame. A constant hand at the flue." "And who minds the woods?" Jan Royce said, amused in a way that did not make mock of anyone at the table, except perhaps himself. "When men come to take sticks for fires from trees they do not own." "We do," Davos said. "Woo, my lords, at this very board. If a plank across barrels may be called a board, are the woodsmen and the charcoal burners, and the men who, when the cart breaks, walk instead." He raised his mug. "To walking." "To walking?" Lord Wyman said with a little wheeze that was laughter. He turned his small eyes to Gendry. "If they call you Baratheon, lad, will you be brave enough to speak of mud?" "I am not brave," Gendry said. "Then perhaps you are wise," Wyman said. "The rest can be learned." On the third day, a motion was made that every claimant of blood to the throne should stand, state his claim, and be done with it. Some rose with a flourish, with pedigrees so long that a boy's voice was pressed into service to finish the recitation. Some stood alone. One man with bright hair and the face of an eagle talked about dragons as if they were ships, a thing that you built and then sailed, and Gendry watched heads shake in subtlety, or not at all. "Go when they call you," Davos said, as if Gendry might have thought to run. "Say nothing you do not mean. Remember the smell of the quench." They called him late in the day, when the light through the rent in the tower was the color of old gold. Gendry walked to the clear space with his hands empty, and wished, wildly and with a blacksmith's superstition, that he had touched his hammer before he came. He had wanted to come in his working clothes, but Davos had made him put on a tunic that had once belonged to a bailiff too fat to keep his post, and some seamstress of Davos' acquaintance had cut it down and made it fit as if it had been measured on him. It itched. He stood. The hall breathed in. "My name is Gendry," he said, because his throat wanted to lock, and he knew if he did not force it open, now he never would. "Gendry Waters. I was born in King's Landing. I was apprenticed in Tubbo Mott's forge, and I paid for my keep with my sweat. My mother was a tavern girl, and I do not know her name because she died when I was little. Men have told me that my father was Robert Baratheon. I did not ask for that. I did not earn it. I did not deserve it. I did not refuse it when it got me beaten by boys with better shirts. I am a bastard. I have been hungry. I have been cold. I can make a plow that will hold together for a season and a hinge that won't squeal after the second rain. That's my blood's work." "Ben?" The quiet deepened. He heard the cough of a man trying not to cough. "If you want a king who looks fine on a coin," Gendry said, "you have men prettier than me in this hall. If you want a king with a song behind him, you have men with songs older than my mother. If you want dragons, fine dragons. If you want a man who will fill your tables with good wine and your beds with laughter, look elsewhere. I won't lie. I don't know your books. I don't know which cousin married which aunt 300 years back that makes me worth more than the next man's throat. I know what a lever is and how to use it. I know that a door is only as good as the bar behind it and the wood that feeds it. I know that if you do not put sand on fresh mortar, the sun will crack it." Bah! A ripple went through them. A quizzical sound, a little disbelieving, and he let it. "If you make me king?" he said. And the words felt like taking a blade from a fire and knowing it would harden or shatter for good in this next plunge. "I'll ask you for what I know the realm needs. Not grand things. I'll ask for weights and measures under a single law. I'll ask for roads that can carry wagons through spring without drowning. I'll ask for ships that carry grain from where there's too much to where there's hungry mouths. I'll ask for a tax cut in years when the frost takes the barley. I'll ask for justice that does not change when a man wears velvet instead of wool. You want peace? Peace is nails and rope and honest counting. That's what I know. That's what I can make. Down. He stopped. The light had shifted. Dust turned in it like little fish. I will swear not to burn your sons for disagreeing with me. I will swear not to waste your gold on statues while your bridges fall down. I will swear to call another council if I see my hand going crooked. I will swear to be what I am and not pretend at being better. The rest I cannot swear. I don't know how to sing you into liking me. I can promise you no dragons. I can promise you only this. I will remember the price of a loaf. Down. He stepped back and waited for his heart to slow. He could feel his pulse in his teeth. Someone laughed. Startled, kindly. And then the noise came up like a low tide. Murmurs like cloth dragged over wood. Davos' head was bowed, but Gendry knew the look beneath his hand. He had seen it when a man watched his boat right itself in surf, and realized he had put the strakes true. After that, there were other speakers, and the same words bent in new shapes. He sat and did not hear much of it, and yet pieces got through. Roy saying that oaths were given to lineages, but loyalty is given to deeds. A Reach Lord saying in a thin voice that the drought 3 summers ago had taken his tenants' children one by one, and that he would never forgive the city for dancing while he buried little bones. A Septon from Crackclaw Point telling a story about a man who had made a bridge out of boats. Gendry thought, boats roped together, the push of water. He thought, levers. In the evenings, there were councils within the council. Davos took him through them like a guide in a city where all the alleys looked alike until he pointed at some little broken tile and said, turn here. In one tent, they found Davin Lannister with his hair like bronze, and a manner that said he expected men to obey him, and was not cruel when they did. The West wants to be left alone to count its coins. Davin said cheerfully, I say this as a criticism and as a comfort. We can live with a Baratheon who is no one's puppet. We can live with the Targaryen girl if she swears not to light our vineyards on fire. We can live with a 7-headed goat if it stays in the city and doesn't kick us. He looked Gendry over and nodded. You don't look like a goat. Better than I hoped, Gendry said. Davin grinned without offense and sent for wine. In another tent, Jon Royce and 2 Vale lords stood around a map and argued line widths. You will not get the Vale unless you promise to stop the crown from picking our bones for court, one of them said flatly. We have had our fill of sending boys to die for songs. I won't send boys to die for songs, Gendry said. I ask them to die for bridges. I'll die with them if the bridge is mine. They looked at him as if he had said something indecent. Then Jon chuckled once and shook his head. The realm has a low taste these days, he said. It craves plain bread instead of sugar. I could stand to try a slice. The north came like weather, cold, unignorable, with fur on its collar. Lady Sansa Stark did not travel, but she sent men, and one woman with will in her face who said, Winterfell is well considering. She had the air of a person who knew how to listen for liars and was always disappointed when she found them. We are not here to kneel, she added. We are here to decide whether we need not kneel. You want independence, Davos said, not as a question. We want to stop bleeding, she said. We want the men in gold cloaks to stop thinking that our girls are prizes when they come south. We want our summer bread kept for winter instead of sold west for pretty trinkets. Now wonder. Gendry found himself saying, if I am king, you will call your own levies and keep them, and you will pay your taxes to your own chest, and only the portion agreed to will come south, and it will be written so in a charter with the ink of 100 hands. If I am king and I break that, put my head on a spike. Don't argue about it. Don't write me a letter. Take my head. If I don't break it, then bring your winter to our tables when we go hungry, and I vow I'll send you grain when your spring is late. Nemtor. The woman's gaze did not soften, but it changed. I'll carry that, she said. I'll carry the words exactly. The faith had its own tent, which smelled of wax and wool, and a patience that could snap. The High Septon met Gendry alone. Surprisingly, without any of the bees that usually ring a hive. He took Gendry's hands in his scarred ones and turned them palm up. "Callous," he said, as if he had found a gemstone in a dike. "They're a smith's hands," Gendry said, self-conscious. "They are hands that will not quake at doing what they say," the High Septon murmured. "The realm craves atonement. It has done things in the last years that it does not know where to put. We would like to offer it a place. We would like to offer you one too." "I'll need your blessing," Gendry said. "You'll need your own," the High Septon said. "A blessing's good for tallow and weddings. What you are asking for is something colder." He looked up into Gendry's face, and for a moment, they were two men in a storm with no roof near. "Do not promise me piety. Promise me care." "I can promise you this," Gendry said, thinking of the woman who had said he had his eyes, thinking of the boy running with a stick pretending it was a sword, thinking of Davos fishing a bone from his teeth in silence. "I will put the poor and the soldiers and the workers at the top of the list when we count." "That will anger those who believe the top of any list belongs to God," the High Septon said, and did not sound as if he were warning. "Do it anyway." On the sixth day they took a vote of sorts, an ugly mechanics thing, not the clean bright coin flip nobles prefer. House by house and banner by banner. The voices fell. Some were loud, some were reluctant, some were given by stewards to whom the weight felt too large. No name rose in a clear bell at first. There were Targaryens, and there were abstentions, and there were great houses that wanted only to see who would put his hand in the fire before they agreed to warm their own. But when the stones were counted, when the scratches were tallied and the marks were inked, when the Archmaester called out numbers in that dry voice of his, and some men's faces went pale, as if they had lost at dice, the lords and ladies of the realm found, with a surprise that felt to Gendry like the sound of something big and old giving way, that they had chosen a smith. There was a hush, and then two sounds at once. The brittle, choked laughter of disbelief, and the roar of men who had always thought themselves cheated, discovering that the cheat had, for once, gone the other way. The High Septon stood. "Then let us make what we have said into what we will do," he called. His voice climbed the stones as if it had been meant for that. "Gendry Waters, kneel." Gendry did not. Not at once. He looked about him at faces like coin edges, at Davos, who had the faintest grin and the wettest eyes, at Brienne with her chin lifted, at Wyman Manderly holding a crust of bread as if he had forgotten it between finger and thumb. He saw men who hated him already because he had spoilt their certainty, and men who loved him already because he was simple enough to see. He saw boys in the shadows craning without being noticed, the future peering past the present like a younger brother. The point of the throne was not here, but he felt it anyway, like a reminder, like a thing in his boot that would not stop pricking until he sat and bled. He went to one knee. The stone was cold. The hall breathed. "Say your name," the High Septon said. "Gendry," he said, his voice strange in his ears. "Son of..." The word father was too small and too big, and he let it rest. "Gendry of King's Landing. Gendry Waters. Will you take the name Baratheon?" the High Septon asked. "Will you bear the antlered crown and the weight that is its shadow?" "I will take the name," Gendry said. "I will bear the weight." It went through him like a spike, and left him in two pieces that had to learn to talk to each other. "Who stands for him?" the High Septon asked, and voices said, "Storm's End, and the West, and the Vale, and the Riverlands." And after a small pause that made the sound sharp as clean metal, "The North reserves its answer, and will send terms." "Who stands against him?" the High Septon asked, because the faith understood better than most that to turn your head from an enemy is to offer them your neck. A handful of names sounded. A Targaryen cousin with dragons in his bedtime stories. A man from old Volantis with eyes full of smoke. A woman who had set her heart on a song and could not be made to put it away 2 reachmen with gardens in their minds that had never known hail. The hall took note of them the way a woodsman takes note of an adder under a stone. Not frightened, not careless. "Bring the crown," the High Septon said. The crown that came was not the light circlet with rubies that the songs favored. It was Robert's antlered thing, heavy enough to bend a man's neck if he wore it long and without relief. Gendry had seen it once before, in a dream he had not understood at the time. He bowed his head. The metal touched his hair and settled there with the intimacy of a hand. He felt the weight spread through his bones, the way warmth spreads from a cup of mulled wine into cold fingers. It was not warmth. It was the idea of it. "Rise, Gendry Baratheon," the High Septon said, voice carried by the hush. "Rise, King of the Andals, and the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, Protector of the realm." He rose. The crown did not tip. For a breath he had a wild thought that it was a trick crown made of tin, lighter than a lie. And then his neck burned, and he understood that the trick, if there was one, was in him. The hall shouted. It shouted like men at a tourney, and like women at a birth, and like a field at first rain after a long dry. It shouted like all those things together. The sound pushed against him and through him, and made the hair on his arms rise. Davos came to him through the press of bodies. He didn't kneel. He put his good hand on Gendry's arm as if they were in a skiff together, and a gust had come up. "Now," he murmured, "you begin to take nails out of the wrong doors and set them in the right ones." "Now," Gendry said, and his voice was steadier than he felt, "I find out what a king's hands are for." That night, the castle's great ruin ate their fires and their joy like a glutton. But it fed something back. Gendry walked the outer wall with his guards gods, and felt the antlers on his head whenever a breeze took them. Below, the tents glimmered like fish scales, and even the men who had voted against him laughed with their neighbors, because laughter is the one tax no sovereign can collect. At a brazier near the broken tower, he found Brienne of Tarth watching the sky as if it were a book she had not read. She straightened when she saw him, and then, after a heartbeat, she bowed very slightly. "I'll need a Lord Commander," Gendry said. "I'll need more than that, but I'll need that." "You don't want me in that armor," she said, surprising him. "I am better in the field than in a hall. The Kingsguard exists to make a picture of the promise a king ought to be. I do not look well in white." "Beshast. You look like oath," he said. "And I want the picture to look like what it says." She considered. "If I accept," she said, "you will have a sword that does not praise you when you do wrong. I'll not be your painted conscience. I'll be your wall. But a wall that does not pretend the wind is warm." "I don't know how to do wrong with anyone praising me," he said. "I don't know how to do wrong without knowing it for what it is. I am going to do wrong, though. A lot of it. There's no way through this much breaking without stepping in someone's garden. I want a sword that tells me when I'm ankle deep in flowers." "Oh." She smiled. It touched the scar on her face and did not wash it away. "Then I'll be your sword," she said, "until I die or you do." "Let's try to make it me," he said, and she snorted, and he found himself warm despite the wind. He slept badly again, but this time when he woke to the gray before dawn, there was no sense of something undone, only a list unfurling like a paper held by a clerk with a bad temper. He ate bread and cheese and salted venison with Davos, who used a knife as if he were bargaining with the meat, and then they set to. Letters first. To the lords who had voted for him and the lords who had not, to the north with its reserved judgment and its cold hunger for truth, to Old Town and the Citadel, to Bravos not asking for coin, but for kindness to ships flagged in his name, to Gull Town, to White Harbor, to Lannisport, to the Arbor. He could not make his hand in the fine courtly script, so he signed in a bold block that looked like a man cutting wood. Gendry. People would gasp about it and say it was coarse. He liked that. Charter of weights and measures, Davos said with a face that implied he had swallowed lemon and liked it. Guild oversight, without letting the guilds become a second crown. Reform of the gold cloaks, because a city without honest watchmen is a chicken coop without hinges. Relief for the riverlands. Plank roads over the mud, grain loans from the reach and the arbor. Stone cutters with work for 5 years. Work drew men like a fire draws cold hands. He would make work and watch what it did. Brienne came at mid-morning with a list of names for a guard that would be hers and his both. She had chosen no peacocks. She had chosen a quiet man from the Trident who had tossed his sword into a weir and gone back into the water for it when he learned a child was trapped behind him. She had chosen a woman from the Dornish marches who could shoot a wren out of a tree at 40 paces, and did not boast about it. She had chosen a greybeard from Black Tide who had once held a pier against raiders with a fish spear, and refused a purse afterwards because he did not like the feel of the man who offered it. The white cloaks would not be pure white under him. They would be a cloth patched from the realm itself. And he liked that too. At noon, a delegation of merchants from Maidenpool presented a petition with all the courtesy of a man trying to sell you your own shirt. They wanted a tax break. He wanted proof that they would not pass the savings on to themselves. Lower your prices on fish, he said, and I'll have the toll for your casks at the city gate for a year. Put it in a ledger with both numbers, in a hand I can read. They blinked, muttered, agreed, and he felt as if he had knocked a dent out of a pot with one swing. Near evening a boy came to his tent, the same one from the piss route, eyes like little bits of sky in a muddy street. He ducked, stood, ducked again, as if he did not know whether he was allowed to be the height he was. "Your Grace," he said, and the words made Gendry's teeth ache. "Your Grace," they said. "I mean, I heard. Are you the king?" "That's what they tell me," Gendry said. "If I am, do you have to call me that?" "It sounds heavy." The boy grinned like a man who had not expected to, all summer, and then choked it back down. "I'm Tom," he said. "I was thinking, if... Gendry prompted. "If you're king," Tom burst out. "Will you stop them charging 2 coppers for a pot of stale beer at the Soldiers' Rest?" "It's not worth 2 coppers? It's not worth 1. Gendry laughed. The boy's boldness, the smallness and hugeness of his ask. He wanted the world to be fair in the place he knew it, which is what everyone wants. "Tell you what, Tom, you bring me a tally of prices in 3 inns. The Soldiers' Rest, the Jolly Squire, and the 3 sheaves. What they charged this week and last. And if I see they went up because we're all here, I'll send a man to ask them why their beer got better when the road didn't. And we'll see what happens next." Tom's mouth opened. He shut it. He looked ready to run to the ends of the camp and back. "Eh," he said, and then remembered and fumbled. "Your Grace. Tell them the king likes beer and hates cheats," Gendry said. "It's a start." When the stars came out, they were as sharp as awls against the night. Gendry stood at the edge of the godswood and looked at the weir stump and thought of men who had knelt before trees, and men who had kneeled before stones, and men who had bowed to nothing but hunger and weather. He thought of Robert Baratheon as he had been told of him. Laugh like thunder, hands like hams, tears that fell only when they did not matter, and never when they did. He thought of the mother he could not see in his memory. He thought of Arya with a line of dirt on her cheek, and the way she had said his name like she were testing a knife's edge. He thought of Davos counting nails, and Brienne counting oaths, and Wyman Manderley counting loaves. He thought of Tom counting beer. He lifted the crown off and held it in both hands. The antlers pricked his palms. He had wielded heavier tools. He had wielded nothing that meant to make him into something other than what he was. He set it on a stump and listened to the night. Somewhere, an owl called. Somewhere, a man told a joke, and another man laughed. The way men who might be enemies laugh before they remember what they are supposed to be. "You'll do," he told the night softly, not certain whether he was addressing himself or the realm. "You'll do, and you will not break." The realm did not answer. It rarely does. It waited to see what kind of hammer he would be. And Gendry, who had not asked to be born of a king but had been asked to become one, squared his shoulders and made a list of nails. The days that followed felt like the first days after a forge. was relit in a long-shuttered shop. Everything familiar and everything strange, the same light with a different meaning. What he had once called lists became statutes when a dozen hands had signed them and a half-dozen more had argued them into shape. The same steady pressure he used to draw bar long went now into words, and they did not stretch as readily as iron. They bucked. They kinked. Then, with enough heat and the proper blow, they came right. He learned the rhythm of the hall, dawn letters, morning audiences, the noon run of petitions, the slow tide of envoys, and the long watchful dusk with Davos that tasted like the sea even in a ruined inland castle. He kept the antlered crown on his head during the daytime until he understood the weight, then set it on the table where he could see it. The men who came to speak to him kept peeking at it, as if it might leap like a stag and gore them. Tom came back with a scrap of parchment the color of dishwater and the pride of a conquering lord in his thin chest. He had written each inn's prices in a hand that looked like spider legs picking their way across a page, and then, beneath, what they had charged the week before, and then, because someone had told him to be thorough, or because he had made a clerk out of himself by being bold, the cost of a loaf of the worst bread in each street he had passed. Gendry looked at the sums and looked at the boy's face, and felt something in himself settle. "Good," he said, tapping the figures. "Better than mine would be. My letters go fat when I'm tired. Take this to Davos." He looked down at the awkward lines of numbers that had, to his eye, more truth than a dozen coats of arms. "You want work, Tom?" The boy's mouth opened, and then shut. And he gave a brief, hard nod, as if any extra motion might crack the yes and spill it. Gendry told Davos, and Davos gave the boy a stool in the corner of the tent and a quill that stained his fingers black. And before night, Tom had a slate board and a clean shirt that did not gape under one arm. The next day he came with 2 other boys and a girl who heard sums better than either of them, and the day after that, she had started to make tallies of grain casks the Reach merchants had promised to lend to the Riverlands at a rate that would not make widows out of wives left behind. The vote had made a king. The work made a court. On the last morning at Harrenhal, he walked the broken kitchens and the old warped benches where men had gnawed on bones centuries ago and left teeth marks like runes. He ran his hand over the black rock where fire had cooked the castle through, thinking uselessly of water and sand, and the way heat can run through a thing and leave it changed without appearing to break it. There were scars here older than his grandfather's fathers. He found the stump of a tree in a corner where a sapling had once tried to be a god's wood and failed. Brienne came upon him there with her hair damp from training and the smell of leather and oil on her. She stood beside him without speaking. It was a comfort to be near someone who used silence as well as a sword. "Do you ever wear your old armor?" he asked, because the question had been standing behind his teeth for an hour and he had no business with it. "When it fits," she said. "Armor teaches habits. Some you keep, some you throw away because they save the wrong parts of you." She shot him a look. "You, for instance, need to stop turning sideways when you are frightened." He laughed, a short sound that startled a bird out of the ruin above. "I turn sideways. You present the left shoulder," she said, canting her own as if showing him a mirror. "There's an old bruise maybe, a memory about that side." "Then see you. I broke a collarbone when I was a boy," he said. "Fell off a cart." The man laughed because he said smiths shouldn't be clumsy. "I suppose I've been guarding it since." He glanced at the crown lying on the bench where he had left it, and was shocked to find he had left it. "You're sure you want to do this?" "I'm sure I want to keep one oath in a world that finds oaths easy to say and hard to hold," she said. "If that means standing between you and men who think their pride is a kind of law, then I will stand. But I won't flatter. I'll say when I think your hammer's gone crooked." "Now." "Say it loudly," he said. "They'll only hear you if it rings." He left Harrenhal in a column that felt less a parade than a promise. The banners went up for the first mile, and then came down as the wind worked at the men's arms and the cloth began to tire. A sensible army learns when to fold pride away. Davos rode at his right hand and Brienne at his left, and behind them came a dozen men and women in plain mail who had not yet put on white, because it would take time to cut the cloaks and stitch the sigils, and because Brienne would not allow a man to wear honor he had not earned by the 3rd hour of the day. The road out of the blasted castle felt like the tale of some beast that had refused to die. Stones the size of houses collapsed in on themselves to make a kind of spine. They stepped carefully. At the first village, which had no name anyone spoke, and yet had fields and a pond, and 3 houses stout enough to stand while men argued, he dismounted when he saw the broken bridge. Broken was generous. 2 spans still held. The middle one had come down in the last storm and thrown boulders into the creek like teeth knocked from a jaw. A woman with elbows like hinges and a face like ground grain stood on the bank with her hands on her hips. And 3 boys, 2 barefoot and 1 wearing boots too big for him, were trying to rig a rope and a plank in a sling to swing a sheep across. "They'll drop the sheep," Davos said conversationally. "They'll save the rope," Gendry said, and he could not seem to help himself. He swung down and went to where the water ran, and the stones made their own logic of angles and weight. He crouched. Squinted. Saw how a lever might crack one lodged rock free, and how a timber might take the load of another if a team of men pushed in rhythm. He asked the woman for 2 poles and a length of chain, and because she was the sort of woman who kept such things in good repair, she sent her youngest to the shed, and he ran back with them in his arms, and the look a child gets when an adult has soiled the natural order of things by being useful. "Your Grace," Brienne said gently, meaning you should not, meaning the river was cold, and his crown was a beacon, and he would be made a story out of this that might yet do him harm. "I'll not sit my horse and watch boys learn they were wrong if I can help it," he said, and waded in and felt the honest bite of water around his thighs, and then his hips as he leaned his shoulder into the pole. Davos came after with a grunt and a curse that had salt in it. The chain bit into his palms. He set the pole and leaned, and the rock that held the river's tantrum in place at last gave way. With a sucking groan that made the boys shout, they heaved the timber, reset the second stone into a better purchase, slung the plank to make a temporary way, and held it while the woman marched the sheep across the creek by main force, speaking to it as if it were a man who had borrowed money and not paid it back. Someone cheered. He could not see who in the sun. He stepped back to the bank and only then remembered he wore a crown. The antlers glinted. Water ran down them and dotted his nose. A boy who had been watching with his mouth open said, "The king's got mud on his breeches," and everyone laughed the way people do when something inside them unwinds. He remounted in a squelch. Brienne's face was the expressionless regard a teacher gives a student who has just done exactly what she had told him not to, and done it well. "If you must," she said. "Next time leave off the antlers." "Next time I'll mind the crown," he said, and could not keep from smiling. They moved on. Every mile south revealed a new hurt. Crops resown twice because the first plantings had been trampled by someone else's quarrel. Orchards left to go wild because the hands that had pruned them were bones under a ditch. A toll gate set up by men in no livery who grinned with a mayor's confidence and had, behind the grin, brigand eyes. On that last, Brienne put her horse to a canter and reached the gate first, and the men there discovered that the difference between soldiers and thieves is not always the hat a man wears, but what he does when a sword is drawn. She broke their cudgel, broke their nerve, and then, after they had been disarmed and made to stack their stolen coins on the table, and made to understand that the king had a keen eye for who robbed with parchment and who robbed with knife, she had one of Gendry's scribes, a freckled woman called Edlin, who had once kept tavern books, put the toll into a ledger with the names of the men who had paid it and the men who had taken it, and men remember being written about, she said under her breath. "It makes them citizens. Will it keep them honest?" Gendry asked. "No," she said, "but it will make them recall that they promised to try, in case they ever get tired of forgetting." They saw the sea again near Duskendale, the water a swatch of hammered tin under a sky like beaten pewter. Davos walked with him to the jetty where the waves flapped and smacked like lazy dogs, and they talked of ships. The master of ships was a question hanging between them, as every other office was. Gendry had a list for each. Master of coin, master of laws, master of whisperers, a grand maester, if Old Town consented to send one not grown fat, on other men's quiet. Some names were the sort of names men expect, lords with lands and titles and nephews, and some were not. He found himself thinking of the woman from the marches who could hit a wren at 40 paces and had not boasted. He thought of Edlin with her ledger. He thought of Tom with his slate. Choose a shipman who knows what it is to drown, Davos advised. Hell be worth 10 who know only sails. Choose a man of coin who has been poor and stayed decent. Choose a lawman who has broken the law once and then wished he had not for 7 years. The wind blew his hair into a froth. Choose a whisperer who tells you when he cannot hear a thing. Most of them won't. They'll invent truths to keep your ears sweet. You'll be hand, Gendry said, because they had traded the word around the fire and in a dozen half-private corners, and he had learned that a king is not only what he decides, but when he owns it. Davos did not do him the discourtesy of arguing first out of ritual. He looked at the sea as if it might offer some different work. I'll be your hand, he said after a moment. So long as you accept that sometimes I'll be your foot, kicking you when you can't feel the ground under you for all this talk. He lifted a palm. Not literally. I've done enough of that in my time. Gendry cracked a grin. You can kick me if I start building statues. If you start building statues, Davos said, I'll put a sheet over your head and call the faith down on you for pride. Now, about coin. You'll need to pay men to mend roads, or they'll mend themselves with men's backs until the backs break. You'll need to pay for grain in the riverlands and for the carts to bring it. You'll need to pay to lift a few fallen towers, or people will go on dying from bricks as well as blades. He enumerated the debts in a sailor's finger count, each knuckle like a knot in a rope. You'll need to do it without borrowing so much from Bravos that you find your dinner served cold, because a book in a tower says the firewood belongs to a man across the sea. I wrote them, Gendry said. I asked for patience, not coin. You did, Davos said, approving, and then tilted his head slightly. Expect them anyway. The Iron Bank loves a king who thinks he can't be bought. He's the cheapest kind. Neverwind. The road from Duskendale to King's Landing curved along the bay, and when the city came into view, it did not rise out of the distance like a dream, the way some men described it. It lay squat on its 3 hills behind its walls, bristling with 100 little angers and a few large ones. Wearing the afternoon light like a veil it had torn in the morning. The smell hit before the sight. The brine, the rot, the sour sweet of overripe fruit dumped behind a vendor's stall, the iron tang of 1,000 little cuts. A city is a wounded thing that never quite stops bleeding. It makes its own scab every day. The banners went up again, because men cannot ride into a city without making noise about it. And horns were blown, and someone had found drummers who beat on their heads with a righteous fervor that made old women on stoops spit only half-heartedly as they watched. He entered by the river gate, not the king's, because he had told Davos that a name is a kind of lie, and I'd rather speak a true one when he could. He had written to the poor wardens of the river gate to sweep the approach, and they had done it with pride. The gold cloaks who lined the way were less gold than brass in their armor, but they stood straight and kept their hands firm on their poles, and when they saluted, it was together. Their commander met him in the square, a lantern-jawed man with a scar on his mouth that had healed badly. Your Grace, he said, and there was no flattery in it or resentment either, only report. Watch Captain Harlan. We've 600 sound men, 200 more that will be sound in a week if put to decent duty, and 300 we should turn back to their wives because they drink more than they stand. The barracks on Widow's Alley is rotten. The barracks on Widow's Alley is rotten. We've been told to put a tax on beggars by Lord, by the master of coin gone before. It made of my sort less like than were useful. He stopped, as if he had just remembered he spoke to a king and not to a neighbor. Stop it, Gendry said, because if the world were a nail and he had a hammer, he would drive that one home. If men have to pay to be poor, it's because a thief in a velvet hat got there first. Harlan's mouth did a small, curious thing that might have been a smile if he had practiced more as a boy. Your Grace, get me a list. Gendry said. Names of the men who shake the poor. Names of the men they report to. If you fear to write them, say them into a page's ear and let my man write them. We will not forget. The city had dressed itself in haste. Bunting hung between houses like laundry on wash day. The bells of a dozen septs had been told to make a noise, and they did, even if the rope left blisters on some boy's hands in the ringing. At the foot of Aegon's high hill, he still had to say the name as if he were recalling an old tool and what it was for. He dismounted. The Red Keep's halls had a smell he had known once and then sworn never to know again. Polished stone and oil, dry rushes underfoot, the sour hint of fear in the corners. He did not walk quickly. He did not walk slowly. He put his feet down with care as if on a roof beam that would not bear the weight of a man who pretended it would. The throne looked like a thing somebody's bad temper had spat up. He had seen it before, once, at a distance, and in dreams where a boy's pride had pretended it mattered. It was worse up close. A pile of promise and threat, edges that glinted even in the flat light of the hall. He did not go to it. He went to the place a small council was held. A chamber off the great hall with a table shaped like a shield and windows that did not open, because the last man who preferred a breeze had been pushed out one. He set the crown on the table and stood with his hands on either side of it, and waited while Davos and Brienne, and the handful of others he had pulled behind him out of Harrenhal, arranged themselves in chairs like men testing the safety of ropes. "Be seated, Your Grace," an usher murmured, in the tone of someone who announces the weather. "In a moment," he said. "In a moment I'll be seated more than I wish to be seated for the rest of my life." He took a breath. "Davos Seaworth, you are my hand. You'll find a different chair to sit and curse in, I promise you. But for now, take that one." Davos did, making a face as if the chair might bite. "Sir Brienne of Tarth, you are Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Your cloak will be white when your tailors have wrung a river into it. Until then you command with the color you have." "Your Grace," she said simply. "For Master of Coin," he went on, and the room stiffened because this was the place where kingdoms bled out or grew fat. "I want a man who counts what isn't meant to be counted and makes it true." Edlin, the freckled woman, blinked at him, as if he had addressed the table. "May? You kept tavern books that the owners swore were uncheatable, and then found 3 cheats anyway," he said. "You know what price a loaf should be, and why the price men want to ask will ruin a street by winter. You know when a ledger is a story. I want you to read our ledger to the crown as if it were a story, and then cut out the lies." "Bam? Indy, Your Grace," she managed after a beat. "I am no lady. I'm a widow with a good head who can smell bad grain." "Then you are more qualified than I had hoped," he said. "You'll have a staff, and you'll have enemies before the week's end. I can't give you a lord's name, but I can give you guards, and I can give you my word that when men try to go around you, they will find me instead." "MMT." She swallowed, stood, and in a motion so small some men might not have seen it, squared her shoulders as if a cloak had been placed upon them. A cloak made of numbers. "For Master of Laws," he said, "I want a man who understands that law is a plow, not a whip. Bronze Jan Royce, if you will take it." The old lord's brows trooped down and then up again, betraying a surprise that he would claim later not to have felt. "Your Grace, I am a Vale man. My bones ache in the damp of this city. If I say yes, I'll expect to write things that make men in high seats uncomfortable." "Then? That's the point," Gendry said. "Write them as you like," Jan said, and the smallest ghost of humor shifted under his beard. "For Master of Ships," he said to Davos, "I would ask you to name a man who has been poor, who has drowned once in his life, and who knows how to get a laden keel through shoals without swearing at every gull that flies by." Davos rubbed his mouth. "I'll give you 3, and you can pick the one you hate least," he said. "But not today. Today I'd like to show you the harbor with eyes that will be his." "Denbisaur, a Grand Maester," Gendry said to the silent corner where the Archmaester from Harrenhal had set himself. A faint smile on his thin lips, as if he were mourning a past he knew all too well would not come again. We will ask of Old Town. Not a rival king. Not. He lifted his chin. If they send me a man who loves dust more than breath, I'll send him back with clean shoes and a letter pinned to his sleeve explaining why. The Archmaester inclined his head. Some chains weigh less once worn by a man worth bearing them, he said. I shall write Old Town. For... He stopped, because the chair reserved for whispers sat like a mouth without a face. He did not love that chair. The realm needed ears. He did not need a man who filled the air with stories until the truth grew thin. We will let that seat stay empty, he said. If a thing must be heard, let it be said aloud. If men will not confess, let their actions do it for them. Davos made a note. Brienne looked as if she approved of empty chairs on principle. Royce grunted, the sound of an old man letting go of an old habit without calling attention to the letting. They set to work. Edlin asked for men who could count and read. Davos sent to the guild halls for clerks who had been dismissed for refusing to shade figures, and got 3 by dinner time who were gaunt and grateful, and angry enough to carry the numbers like torches through the dark. Harlan of the Watch returned with his list, and it was long. Gendry set the names in a red book a page at a time, and he wrote them slow so he would not forget. Royce drew up a draft of the Charter of Weights and Measures in a hand so even it looked like pewter poured into a mold. The clause on penalties made the Master of Coin raise an eyebrow. Confiscation, if they are twice caught, she said. Half their goods the first time, or they'll cheat till the first frost and pay the fine out of their profits. Half and then all, he said. And a month in the stock for the man who made the false measure, not the boy who was told to bring it to market. Your Grace, she said approvingly, and scratched it in with her ink-stained thumb. He went down into the city with Harlan in plain cloak, and with Brienne a half-step behind, because she had allowed him only that much foolishness, and he stood in the market to listen. The sellers sang their wares in the call and response. A city teaches a man in childhood. A boy hawked eel pies with a voice too big for his chest. A woman in a blue shawl told him with professional candor that the fish from the Blackwater were good today, because the wind had been right, and nobody had dumped rotten guts upriver this morning. A potter showed him mugs with a scrape inside their bottoms, something to hold a man's little finger and make him think his grip was stronger than it was. The trick pleased him. He watched a man short the measure of barley by a thumb's width, and watched him do it again when he thought nobody saw. He said nothing there. He sent Harlan back later with a plain-clothed guard, and a set of true measures marked with a crown and a pair of antlers, and a tiny hammer, and the man found that the difference between clever and criminal is where a ruler lays his eye. Ravens came. They always do. Some flew black with simple news. A bridge out near Lord Harroway's town. A barrow collapsed on the road to Stony Sept. A pox in a hamlet near Saltpans. He sent men and timber and a jar of vinegar for the sick. Some ravens carried more complicated feathers. A lean, elegant hand from Old Town saying that the conclave would consider the king's request for a man not in love with dust. A dry, impersonal script from Braavos acknowledging his letter with a courtesy so exact it tweaked the nose. A clear winter-cold letter from Winterfell that read like a parchment warmed by a hearth and turned stiff again by the air. The northern letter was not over long. It did not waste a word. It spoke of peace as something you could nail into place if men kept their hands steady. It spoke of oaths made in one night and broken the next morning. It spoke of roads, and the way a road is a kind of promise to go and to return. It did not offer fealty. It offered terms. No crown men stationed north of Moat Cailin without written invitation. No crown tithes collected in northern markets by southern officers. Recognition of the king in the south as a partner in war if the dead rose again, as the partner in trade while they did not. A promise that the north would send men to mend the next causeways if the south would send men to lift flooded weirs that sent spring water back into farmers' fields. There was a line near the end that made his skin tighten in a way that was not entirely discomfort. We remember bread sent in a winter when the South was ruled by songs. We remember songs that did not keep our children fed. Give us bread, not music. Lady Sansa wrote this, Davos said, turning the page to read it again, and then not, because he had memorized it the first time. It has her in the lines. She asks what I promised, Gendry said. I said I'd send grain north when the spring was late. You did, Davos said. Tell her when you will send it, and by which road, and in whose wagons. Write down which ports will hold it if snow comes. Count what will be needed and how much song will have to be sacrificed in the counting. Gendry wrote with his blunt letters, the ones that looked as if they had been cut into the page with a dull chisel. He told her what he would do and what he would not. He asked for a winter meeting at Moat Cailin when the worst of the season had passed, to lay the charter with one ink on one parchment for both of them to read together. He told her he would sign where she would see him. Sign, and not in a chamber elsewhere, where ink could be swapped with words. He did not ask for surrender. He asked for function. When he sanded the page and shook the grit off, Davos read it and nodded without smiling. He did not smile when a thing was good. He saved his grin for mistakes, fixed and lucks that had been earned. The Iron Bank sent a man with a face like a polished shutter. He introduced himself as Tregar Ormelin and said he was pleased to meet a king who wrote to decline a loan rather than accept one and pretend he had not. It saves us both time. Tregar said in the careful common tongue of a man who had learned it as a tool and kept it sharp. We have brought you a different instrument. What instrument? Gendry asked, eyeing the leather case the man bore like a priest carries a saint's finger. Bonds, Tregar said. Not coin, not promises and whispers. An accounting of revenue you do not yet have, a price you pay for having it now, and a schedule for when you will have to take the pain. We will not own your docks. We will own a portion of your toll at the mud gate between the months of Maiden's Day and the Queen's Feast for 3 years. In exchange, we will give you enough to mend the river road and lay 2 plank causeways, and pay for a levy that will stand watch while the men who usually watch plow. He placed the case upon the table and opened it to reveal neat sheets of numbers and lines and little diagrams like ship's masts. You will sign here and here, and you will curse me when you settle accounts. I expect to be cursed. I do not expect to be thanked. Edlin read the numbers and frowned as if they were a stew she did not trust, then took a pin and pricked her finger and put 3 dots of blood on the margin and turned the page. It's honest, she said reluctantly, and still a trap. Everything honest can still be a trap. It is only a trap if you believe revenue will spring up like mushrooms after rain, Tregar said. If you believe men will pay to keep their carts out of ruts, then you may find it as a ladder. Gendry thought of the bridge at the nameless village, the way the rock had come loose when they had set the pole at the right angle, and leaned. We'll take a part, he said at last. Not all you offer. We'll make the road in sections. If the first pays as you say it will pay, we will sign for the second. If it doesn't, we will tear up the first in the spring and use the wood for other things. Men are now wine. A king, Tregar said with a wisp of admiration that smelled of honest business, who believes there may be less road in the world rather than more. I am going to have a very dull supper with my fellows. Enjoy your dullness, Davos murmured, and they all signed where ink had been placed. The days ran like poured metal. They ran, and they set. The Kingsguard were named one by one, not for beauty in the picture, but for steadiness of hold. A quiet woman called Mael of Lomtable, who had broken 3 men's arms in a melee and apologized after each. A man of the Reach with old scars that said he had learned something from each. A Riverlander who had once served a bad lord and had quit him at cost. Brienne looked them over and found a rhythm among them that was more important than any one of their gifts. They drilled at dawn in the yard below the Tower of the Hand, and in the afternoon went to the streets in pairs to walk, not in a show of force, but in the way a carpenter walks his own house at night, checking doors, touching beams. The white cloaks, when they came from the fullers and the needlewives, looked odd at first against the city grime, too clean, and then, after a week, the edges had softened and the cloaks moved more like cloth worn by men, and less like flags. Podrick Payne came to present himself with a sword that had been polished to a fever and hands that trembled. Brienne watched him spar with Maet, watched him lose with grace, watched him lose with stubbornness, watched him win once because he had learned in 3 days how to defend the thing he did not think he had a right to keep. Not yet. She said to him briskly when his eyes flicked up to hers after he had bloodied his lip. You'll have the cloak when you wear your defeat without shame. You're half a year away from the man you'll be. Podrick nodded, uncowed. My lady. My lady is for another life, she said. Your commander will do here. He nodded again. Slower. Commander. No. The Faith did not press him for spectacle. The High Septon came to the Red Keep quietly, scars on his hands bare and his robe clean. They sat by a window that looked out on the muddy reach of the Blackwater where boys skipped stones with a seriousness that suggested they thought they were practicing war. The High Septon ate a heel of bread and some cheese and drank water because he had told Gendry once that a man should be careful with the wine he drank when a city watched, and even more careful with the wine he drank when it did not. Your Grace, he said, we've begun to hear confessions that are not sins. Their owners want to put down something heavy and believe they can name it wickedness and be rid of it. They say they have envied the rich. They say they have envied the rich. They say they have hated a man who struck their sister and not been sorry when he broke his leg falling from a cart. They say they have eaten 3 onions when Ration said 2. It is not sin, the realm is birth. Gendry rubbed his mouth. Can you confess ache? You can name it, the High Septon said. You cannot absolve it, but naming is sometimes half the work. He leaned his elbows on his knees like a blacksmith with a problem piece. Have a feast day without a feast. Call it a day for counting. Ask men to count aloud what will make them whole. Then ask them to choose one thing from their count your court can mend. One simple thing, and fix it. Not with parchment, with hands. You want me to turn the city into a workshop for a day? Gendry said, surprised into a smile. I can do that. So can the people, the High Septon said. They are better at it than we admit. They called it in a fortnight. The weather willing, but even the weather seemed to want it. They sent criers to the wards. Bring a list of the one thing your street needs mended most. Don't bring 10. Bring the 1. Men grumbled, because it is the law of the city that a man must have a list long enough to wrap himself in at night to feel warm. Women scoffed, because it is the law of the city that women must disbelieve until hands are on tools. Children were happy because children enjoy being asked to tell adults the obvious. They came with their one thing, and the one things piled up. A pump whose handle had gone loose, a lock misfitted on the public bakehouse, a drain blocked on Hook Alley that had kept Hook Alley smelling of a drowned ox since last winter, a corner where a lantern should be, a shutter that banged. There were larger things too, gaping holes that demanded more than a day. But the smaller ones once named were defeated by attention. He walked with a crew that fixed hinges and put his shoulder to a door for a widow, whose latch had never caught since some men with soldiers' hands had kicked it in during a night's search for someone who had not been there. She cried when the door closed and stayed closed. She put her forehead to the wood as if blessing it. Later, in the dregs of afternoon, when the city smelled almost clean from being stirred and aired, he stood with Davos and Brian at the edge of the mud gate and watched men dragging a stone into place for a new step. His legs ached deliciously. He had done work a king might do and work a man might do, and found that both used the same parts. Look, Davos said quietly. He saw it after a moment. Not the stone or the men, but the way the faces around them had gone easy at the edges. The way some of the anger had been put down for the weight of a hammer, an auger, a length of rope. The way Harlan's men stood straighter, not because they were watched, but because there were things to be kept safe, that were not simply the idea of the king. That night, a raven came from the reach bearing a letter that smelled faintly of apple wood and clean barns. It was from a woman named Lady Melissa Tarley, whose blunt penmanship reminded him of a fence post. She wrote that the arbor had agreed to the grain convoy, that House Redwine's casks were ready, that 2 of her cousins would ride with them to ensure the toll collectors spilt no measures into their own pockets. She wrote that if the crown wanted the harvest to arrive without rotting on the docks, it would have to beat it to the ports with good order. Wine is a prince, she wrote, and will wait. Grain is a farmer. It has to get up in the dark. He liked her at once. He liked less the note from a Targaryen cousin's man, polite, high and thin, stating that his lady would be willing to come to the city under safe conduct and display her dragons for the delight of the small folk, that she hoped the king would honor old blood with a new covenant. He read the line 3 times. He felt the old pull of story, and then the new hard thing he had been learning to cultivate, the habit of asking if a story could be turned into bread. Dragons did not make bread. They made men keep their heads down when the sky went black. He wrote back with courtesy and no promise. He asked for a list of what her presence would cost the city in grain and in coin and in fear. He asked what she would pay herself in any of those. He did not sign it with any flourish. He bought timber. He bought stone. He bought the patience of guilds by letting them keep their honor while requiring them to keep their oaths. He chose men to be road wardens and told them they were paid to watch over the people who were paying them. He set aside a portion of coin for a winter distaff fund, a thing Edlin argued hard for, and he yielded to gladly, to keep widows whose men had died in other people's quarrels from selling their tools when hunger came. He set aside a portion, smaller, for debt forgiveness to a list of names Harlan gave him, men and women who owed the watch because watchmen had been thieves, and he marked those debts canceled with ink the color of oxblood, and a stroke that ate into the page. He went once to Tabhomat's old forge. The sign still swung. The smell was the smell that had written itself into the nerve at the back of his nose before he had grown to his full height. Coal, oil, hot iron, sweat. The man at the anvil was not Mott. He was a journeyman with arms like beams and an expression that said he had kept a shop through too many shortages to be awed by any man who stood in his doorway. He looked at Gendry's face, looked at the hammer in his hand, looked at the stain on his tunic and the wear on his boots and the crown that was not upon his head, and because he had been a smith his whole life, he judged the hammer more than the news. "Want something mended?" he said neutrally. "Yes," Gendry said, and the word felt right. A set of true weights. The man snorted. "Every man says that. Every man means a set that makes me rich. I mean a set that will make men less likely to put my head on a spike next spring," Gendry said, and their eyes met, and the man gave a grunt that might have been laughter but could have been acceptance. He worked alongside him for an hour, losing himself gratefully in the order of coal and heat, the competent rituals that did not change when a title did. The anvil rang. The bar drew down. The scale pan went even. He found at the end of it that he had sweated through his shirt, and his shoulders were easy in a way a man only feels when he has worked in the right fashion for his bones. He left the man with a royal warrant he had not meant to bring, and felt a little shame at the way it had made the man's face open. Men bowed to crowns. They opened to work. News came from White Harbor. Lord Manderly's ships had lifted the first cargo of cheap grain, the good sort that fed legs and not just bellies, and the Lord had eaten the first loaf in his great hall, where all could see him swallow, and then sent a portion to the widow's quarter first, and only afterwards to his knights. It was a gesture. It fed nobody beyond symbolism. People need gestures. He remembered the way the eel lord had said bread like a prayer, and nodded as if Wyman's hand could feel the nod. At night, he slept, and now, finally, sometimes he did not dream. When he did, the dreams were not of crowns or antlers turning to branches and pulling at his scalp like vines, but of simple failures mended, of doors that now shut, of bridges that now held, of a ship sliding into water and not grounding, of a woman who had said he had his eyes. It did not keep ugliness away. Men who had placed their wagers on other claimants looked for the easiest way to recover their losses and discovered again that the easiest way is to cut the throat of a man who has been brave and honest enough to show you where his veins run. Twice, they put knives under cloaks and waited in hallways men had died in before and would die in again. Twice Brienne's people found them, not because of sorcery but because a good guard watches the corners a bad man needs. The first would-be killer wept when he was stripped. His wife was sick and his children had been bought like candles with a promise. He was made to wear a sign around his neck and to sweep the floor outside the kitchens for a month and to eat what the kitchen gave him. It was not mercy. It was the cost of breaking a desperate man without teaching a dozen more men to be desperate. The second assassin had hands that did not shake. He had made a plan that had accounted for good guards and honest chance, and had relied on an amount of luck that might have sufficed if luck had not looked briefly toward Gendry and decided to admire stubbornness. He was given to Royce's law and hanged, not in the square with drums, but out the gate early in the morning where crows and men who went to market early both travel. He died because the city needed to believe that this king would not make a meal out of his enemies, and would not make a feast out of their deaths either. He watched from the wall with his jaw tight and Brienne near. He did not disgust himself with the idea that he could watch and be heroic. He watched because a man should see the results of ink. Then he went back to the hall in a temper that made Davos say nothing at all and set the day in motion with smaller, steadier blows. A letter came from the Vale, from Lady Anya Waynwood, written in a hand that had scolded grandchildren and scours both. She wrote that the Vale would accept the charter if there were a clause forbidding the crown from taking boys as pages to keep them close in the city, under the pretense of teaching them dance and letters and the habit of obedience. She wrote that the Vale wished to keep its boys and its grain and its prayers, and would send iron and song in war and peace in equal measure if left otherwise alone. He liked her too, and not only for the curtness of her logic. He wrote her back to say that the crown cared not a lampwick for where boys learned their letters. He cared that they learned. He asked if she would be willing to send a schoolmaster to instruct a generation of city brats, just to see the spectacle of it. He received, some days later, a reply that read, "It would please me. Try to keep their lice in their own hats." They made, before the first rains that turned King's Landing into a series of arguments between mud and men, a beginning of the river road. A proper beginning, with road crews organized, with a blacksmith's wagon that followed to fix broken pins and rotted hinges, with a tent where Edlin's clerks handed each crew a tally board and chalk. Gendry rode out twice the length of the distance they had made, and looked down the long, wet miles left. It felt like standing over a bar that had just begun to take its shape, and thinking of the hammer blows left. He felt not despair, but an odd contentment. A long job. Those are the kind that leave a man better than they found him, if he does not cheat himself on the blows. On an afternoon gray enough to make noon look like dusk, he climbed the Tower of the Hand with Davos to see the city from the vantage where men who have made worse choices had stood and felt themselves taller than they were. The wind made the hair in Davos' beard hop. The bay lay like a patient, legs numb, waiting for nerve to return. "Storm's End," Davos said after a long silence. "You can live in the Red Keep and pretend you're not slowly turning into the kind of man who has servants to fetch his temper. You could also go to Storm's End and live with the sea and let the wind grind down your pride every morning like a wheelstone. A king who lives in the city becomes a city. A king who lives in the storm becomes a story. Neither one bakes bread. A king who lives in the storm becomes a story." "I'll live in both," Gendry said, after a moment of feeling the wind telling him what he had already known, and needed to hear from something that did not flatter him. "I'll live where the work is wettest. I'll live where the ledger is heaviest. I'll live sometimes where a boy can come to my door and ask for 2 coppers worth of justice and get it. Now," Davos nodded, "then we'll need a way to make the city run while your horse is on the road, not with gossip. With gears, put the small council to law. Put the watch to a schedule that is easy to read and hard to forget. Put the market to a habit." His good hand made a circle in the air. "No king can be everywhere. Any king who tries becomes nowhere." And he drew up, with Royce and Edlin, and the High Septon's quiet counsel, and Harlan's rasping practicality, a charter for governance that made a lattice around the crown. Market days appointed, waits always in sight and marked with the hammer. Tolls posted where any literate boy could read them aloud in the hearing of illiterate men. A court day for petty matters with benches outside, and a rule that anybody who asked for a kindness in the hearing of that court. He carved a little hammer with antlers at the top of the parchment because every law needs a picture to lodge in a citizen's head where it can live. When he signed the charter, Gendry, the letters square and honest, a murmur went through the room, not because the thing was grand, but because it was ordinary and being done by a king. And when he stood, The antlers on the crown on the table caught the light, and for a second, he saw not himself with the weight of his father's laughed-away duties pressing down on him, but a long line of hands to come, and hands that had been, each with a small hold upon the same piece of work. The stubborn, unglamorous, plain business of keeping a city from eating itself. In the kind of evening that looks like morning in the wrong direction, he went back down into the streets with Brienne and Harlan. He bought a mug of beer for 2 copper and tasted it, and made a disgusted face so exaggerated the tapster laughed and said, "That's fair, your grace. I aim for 1.5. He ate an eel pie that was better for the story of the boys' pitch than for anything in the crust. He watched 2 men argue about the price of nails and stepped between them with a simple question. "How many boards are you buying, and what else are you mending?" By the time they had answered, the argument had lost its heat and gained a plan. On the way back up the hill, in the half-light where a certain kind of memory is bred, he saw a wolf on a banner. A little one, painted on a boy's kite, not the stark dire wolf with its teeth in a blizzard. It pulled a tug in his chest. He stood with his head cocked to watch the kite dip and rise against the dull sky. A girl laughed, a sound like a knife sharpened but not cruel, and for a second the world was a street running between who he had been and who he had agreed to become. He did not turn his head sharply. He did not look down alleys for ghosts. He let the laugh pass through him. He thought, "Keep your hammer near." Letters were a river that did not run dry. One came with the smell of cloves in its sealing wax from Sunspear, speaking warmly, and with that precise courtesy Dornish letters all possessed about a marriage to bind south and south to the center. He set it aside without disdain. He set aside 3 such. He did not think of himself as a prize to be swapped for grain or spears. He thought of the women he might be asked to stand beside as allies, and he decided he would wait until the road did not eat up his days and leave him raw. If he married, he would do it when the list of nails had grown shorter and the city's doors closed smooth. He would not make some bright girl a widow to a ledger. He answered the north with dates and the names of ports. He answered Old Town with a request for a man named Marwyn, and then crossed it out because he did not know if the man would come, and wrote instead that he wanted someone who could be trusted to leave a book to mend a bone. He signed papers until the muscles at the base of his thumb knotted. He walked with Harlan under rain that came straight down like a good law and angled in like a bad one. And once, very late, when he could not sleep and the forge in his chest had too much heat for any sensible hour, he took the crown out into the yard and set it upon the anvil. He did not lift his hammer. He did not strike. He ran his fingers along the points and felt the place where the metal had been welded and the place where it had been bent back. Once, by a hand that had been too eager or too sorrowful, he set the thing down, not gently and not hard, and put his palm flat upon it. The antlers bit. The anvil waited. The night had gone quiet in that way that says a city, like a soldier between wars, is listening for a footfall it knows will come. In the morning, the lists waited, long as ever, longer, because each strike on one nail lifts 2 more that men had ignored. He sat. He stood. He walked. He lifted. He said yes and no in measures that amounted to the same thing. A life spent making. When men came to tell him that what he did would not be remembered in song, he asked them how much cloth they would prefer for shrouds, the patterned or the plain. "That is unkind," Davos said mildly after one such, as the man went away chafed but not cut. "It's true," Gendry said. "Songs make men think they can eat rhyme." He went on as he had begun. Slow, thorough, stubborn, he kept the pace of a man who intends for his work to last beyond his tiredness. He did not try to be clean about it. He let the mud take his boots. He did not pretend the crown did not ache. He allowed himself, sometimes, on the very edge of sleep, to imagine the bridge 2 years from now, the charter 5 winters hence, the day when a boy like Tom would have children who woke and took for granted that a pump would draw water because someone had put a hinge true. He could not give them a world without knives. He could give them hinges. He could give them weight. He gave them, as often as the world let him, Enough bread that the songs would be a luxury they could afford not to sing. And somewhere north, under skies that held their blue tight, even when they were gray, a woman in fur opened a letter written in a square hand, and nodded once, and the winter of her eyes did not thaw, but it grew less lonely. And in the vale, an old lady sharpened a pen, and told a boy to boil the lice out of his cap. And in Bravos, a banker with a shuttered face put a small mark beside a line, and said to an empty room, "We will not own him. He will cost more than we earn. Perhaps we will be paid in something less easy to count." And in the red keep a commander of guards who did not flatter men wrapped a white cloak about the shoulders of a young knight, who had learned to wear defeat with grace, and then to trade it for competence. And the king, who had never much liked titles, stood at a window and counted quietly under his breath. Not coin, not men, not debts, not enemies. He counted doors that now shut. He counted the bridges that might hold. He counted from 1 to 7 and back, a smith's hum that made no music in all the sense in the world.